Between 1792 and 1800, over 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would become the most recognizable building in America. Their names were deliberately erased from official records. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves across the District of Columbia. For 2 centuries, the government maintained these omissions weren't accidental, they were policy. In 1901, a restoration crew discovered something beneath the East Wing's foundation that made the superintendent order an immediate halt to all excavation. The workers were sworn to silence. The discovery was rearied within hours. What they found suggested the original construction involved far more than simple labor exploitation. It pointed to systematic concealment of deaths that occurred under circumstances the young republic could never afford to acknowledge. Tonight, you'll hear what those records actually contained. Before we continue with the story of how America's greatest symbol was built on suffering deliberately hidden from history, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us where you're from. These stories belong to all of us, and knowing where our listeners are connecting from makes this community even stronger. Now, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, so you never miss the dark chapters of American history they tried to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. The discovery in 1901 wouldn't be the last time someone stumbled onto evidence of what really happened during those 8 years of construction. But to understand why those findings were so dangerous, you need to know how the project began and who was really forced to build it. Philadelphia served as the nation's capital in 1790. But the Residence Act passed that July mandated a new federal district along the Towick River. President Washington himself selected the precise location in January 1791, 10 mi square carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. The site was hardly the grand landscape depicted in later paintings. It was malarial swampland, dense with mosquitoes, unbearably humid in summer, and populated by scattered tobacco plantations worked by enslaved people who'd been farming that soil for generations. The commissioners appointed to oversee construction faced an immediate problem. The federal government had no money. The entire project, President's House, Capitol, department buildings, roads, would cost an estimated $400,000, an astronomical sum for a nation still drowning in Revolutionary War debt. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed a solution that seemed elegant in its simplicity. Hire enslaved workers. Their masters would be paid a rental fee, typically $5 per month per enslaved person, while the workers themselves would receive nothing beyond basic food and shelter. This arrangement, Jefferson argued in a letter dated March 1792, would keep costs manageable while ensuring the work proceeds without delay or complaint. The chief architect, James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who designed several prominent buildings in Charleston, submitted plans for the President's House in July 1792. His design drew heavily from Leinster House in Dublin, featuring Georgian symmetry and ambitious scale. When Washington reviewed the plans, he insisted on making the building even larger, 1/5 bigger than Hoban's original proposal. This expansion would require substantially more labor, more materials, and more time. The commissioners sent notices throughout Maryland and Virginia. Masters could hire out their enslaved workers to the federal construction project. The compensation was reliable, and the government promised to return the workers unharmed. That promise would prove worthless. By November 1792, approximately 150 enslaved workers had been assembled at the construction site. They came from plantations throughout the region from Leon County, Charles County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Their masters' names appear in the commissioners' payment ledgers: Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent, but the workers themselves were listed differently. The ledgers show only first names, sometimes not even that, just Negro man or Negro boy, followed by an age estimate. Tom, age 23, Peter, age 19, a boy called Harry, perhaps 14, A man named Len, who the records suggest was over 50, too old for such brutal work, but hired out anyway because his master needed the monthly payment. The work began immediately, though winter was approaching. The first task involved clearing the site, removing trees, draining swamp land, excavating the foundation. This meant working waist-deep in freezing mud, using nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and raw strength. The commissioner's letters from that first winter make brief mention of difficulties with the Negro labor due to weather, but provide no details about what those difficulties entailed. A note dated December 14th, 1792 refers to the replacement of 3 workers who could not continue without explaining why they couldn't continue or what happened to them. One worker who did leave a trace in the records was a man named Isaac, hired from a plantation owner named Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a skilled carpenter, one of several enslaved craftsmen brought to the project because their expertise was essential. The commissioner's correspondence shows Isaac worked on the interior carpentry throughout 1793 and 1794, and that Hanson received payment for Isaac's labor through November 1794. Then Isaac's name disappears from the ledgers. No note of his return to Hanson's plantation, no record of sale or transfer, simply absent from the documents as though he'd never existed. Another name that appears frequently in early records is Peter Lennox, a quarryman enslaved by Martha Custis Peter, step-granddaughter of George Washington. Lennox was tasked with supervising stone cutting at the government quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored sandstone for the president's house was extracted. The quarry work was among the most dangerous. Massive blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and transported without modern equipment. A single mistake could crush a man instantly. Lennox's name appears in payment records through 1796, noted as reliable and skilled. After 1796, he too vanishes from documentation. The commissioners Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart rotated through various appointments, but their correspondence reveals a consistent anxiety about the project timeline. President Washington wanted the house completed before his term ended in 1797. This pressure translated into grueling work schedules for the enslaved laborers. Letters between the commissioners and hoban reference working from dawn until dark when weather permits and double crews on foundation work to meet deadlines. These brief mentions hint at the reality. 16-hour days, 7 days a week during good weather with no compensation beyond minimal food. The living conditions were equally harsh. The enslaved workers were housed in temporary wooden structures near the construction site, crude barracks that offered little protection from the elements. An expense record from March 1793 notes the purchase of straw for Negro quarters, suggesting they slept on the ground with only straw for bedding. Another entry from August 1793 authorizes the purchase of salt fish and cornmeal for feeding Negro workers. The cheapest possible provisions, no meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Disease was inevitable. The swampland bred malaria, typhoid, dysentery. The commissioner's letters occasionally mentioned sickness among the workforce, always framed as an inconvenience to the construction schedule. A note from June 1793 complains that the flux has taken hold among the Negro laborers, reducing our available workforce by nearly a third. The flux dysentery could kill within days if severe. The letter says nothing about treatment or recovery, only about the delay it caused. Medical care for enslaved workers was minimal at best. The commissioners hired a physician named William Thornton to attend to workers, but his compensation records show he was paid far less for treating enslaved workers than for treating free white laborers. More tellingly, Thornton's bills show dramatically fewer visits to enslaved workers, despite their larger numbers. When an enslaved person fell too ill to work, the most common solution was to send them back to their master and hire a replacement. This practice left no paper trail of what happened to those who were returned, whether they recovered, whether they died, whether they were sold off to recoup the lost rental income. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson kept a more detailed record than most. Williamson supervised much of the stonework and maintained a diary that survived in his family's papers until donated to the Library of Congress in 1968. His entries from 1794 and 1795 provide rare glimpses into the daily reality. The Negro men work the stone despite bleeding hands, he wrote in April 1794. They are given no gloves, no proper tools for their hands, yet are expected to produce the same quality as trained masons. Several have infections that should be tended. I mentioned this to the commissioner's representative, who said treatment would be provided when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows. Williamson's diary also records an incident from July 1794 that doesn't appear in any official documentation. Today, a scaffold collapsed on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the physician immediately. The 2 Negroes were left where they fell for nearly an hour before anyone attended them. One appears to have a broken back. I suspect he will not survive, and if he does, he will never walk again. This troubles me greatly, but I am told this is not my concern. The man with the suspected broken back was likely a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name appears in payment ledgers through June 1794, then stops. Brent continued to receive payment for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the name changes to Negro man Jim. This pattern, sudden name substitutions in the payment records without explanation, occurs repeatedly throughout the construction period, suggesting workers were being replaced, but the circumstances of their departure were deliberately left unrecorded. By 1795, the structure's shell was largely complete, but interior work would take several more years. The project expanded to include not just the president's house, but also the surrounding landscape, roads, and ancillary buildings. This expansion meant the workforce actually grew during the latter half of the decade, at its peak in 1798, somewhere between 4 and 500 workers labored on the site and in related operations like the quarries, brick kilns, and lumber mills. The majority were enslaved. The commissioner's papers from this period grow increasingly about the enslaved workforce. Earlier letters, at least, mentioned them by category: Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. After 1795, the references become vaguer. Workers hired from area plantations, contracted labor, servants. This linguistic shift wasn't accidental. As the project gained prominence and public attention, the commissioners became more careful about how they documented the workforce composition. They understood even then that the optics were problematic. Here was the house of the president, the symbol of the new republic being built by people who had no freedom in that republic. George Washington himself visited the construction site multiple times throughout the 1790s. His diary entries about these visits focus on architectural progress and timeline concerns. He never once mentions the enslaved workers in these entries, despite the fact that they made up at least 70% of the workforce. This omission speaks volumes about how the founders chose to see or not see the labor that built their institutions. The white laborers on site, immigrants mostly from Ireland and Scotland, were paid actual wages, typically $1 per day for skilled craftsmen, 50 cents for ordinary laborers. They could leave if they chose. They could complain about conditions. They had names in the records that included surnames, places of origin, next of kin. When they were injured, they received medical care and compensation. When they died, they were buried in marked graves and their families notified. None of this applied to the enslaved workers. They had no choice, no voice, no recourse. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything but servants. knowing their children would inherit their chains, knowing their names would be forgotten, while the names of the architects, commissioners, and presidents would be etched into history books. But some of them left marks anyway. Small, deliberate acts of presence that would only be discovered centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a problem to the commissioners. Several stone blocks being set into the north wall bore strange markings. Shallow scratches that appeared deliberate rather than accidental damage from quarrying or transport. Hoban's letter dated April 3, 1796, describes them as crude symbols or letters, purpose unknown. He asked whether the blocks should be replaced or simply turned inward so the markings wouldn't be visible. The commissioner's reply, dated April 10th, instructs Hoban to turn the stones inward and continue construction. The markings are likely meaningless scratches from handling. The letter states, "There is no need to delay work for such trivialities." The incident was considered closed, but the markings weren't meaningless. They were names. Enslaved workers with stone-cutting skills had carved their names, or sometimes just initials, into blocks they'd shaped. The carvings were subtle, easily dismissed as accidental marks unless you knew what to look for. They were acts of extraordinary courage, because if discovered during the carving, the punishment would have been severe. But they did it anyway. These men whose names appeared in ledgers only as Tom or Peter or Negro Man. They carved THNPL and sometimes full names like Isaac into stone, then sent those stones to become permanent parts of the president's house. It was their way of saying, "We were here, we built this, remember us." Hoban never reported finding additional marked stones, which suggests either he stopped noticing or stopped reporting. Given the commissioner's dismissive response, the latter seems more likely. Why bother the commissioners with something they'd already deemed irrelevant? The marked stones weren't discovered again until 1902, during Theodore Roosevelt's renovation of the building. Workers removing plaster from interior walls found the stones with their carvings turned inward exactly as Hoban had been instructed to place them. The renovation supervisor, a man named Charles McKim, made a note of the discovery in his private records, found various stones with crude markings on interior faces. Some appear to be initials or names. Origin uncertain, likely made by workers during original construction. McKim's note suggests he understood the significance, but no official report was ever filed. The stones remained in place, hidden behind new plaster. But the marked stones were only a small part of what had been deliberately concealed. The more significant hiding began in the summer of 1797, following an incident that could have destroyed the project's already fragile reputation. July 1797 brought one of the worst heat waves anyone could remember. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees for days on end. The combination of extreme heat, swampland humidity, and inadequate water supplies created catastrophic conditions for the workers. Within 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved laborers fell ill with what the commissioner's correspondence refers to vaguely as summer fevers. The commissioners sent urgent letters to plantation owners. "Your workers have taken sick and cannot continue. Send replacements." These letters are unusually numerous for late July and early August 1797. At least 23 survive in the archives. Each requests immediate replacement workers, which suggests the number of sick workers exceeded 23, possibly by a substantial margin. What happened to those workers? The commissioner's papers contain no follow-up correspondence explaining their fate. The plantation owner replies where they survive are Turk acknowledged, replacements sent. No mention of the sick workers being returned, no mention of their recovery or death, nothing. Colin Williamson's diary entries from this period are harrowing. The sickness spreads through the Negro quarters like wildfire. He wrote on July 23, 1797, "I have seen at least a dozen men too weak to stand, yet there is no physician attending them. They lie in those wretched barracks burning with fever, and no one seems concerned except to determine when replacement workers will arrive." I asked the commissioner's man what provisions have been made for treatment. He told me the sick ones have been moved to an isolated area to prevent contagion spreading to the other workers. When I asked where this isolated area was, he became evasive and told me it was not my affair. Williamson's entry from July 28th is more disturbing. I have learned where the sick are being kept. There is a hastily constructed shed near the old kiln site, perhaps a /4 mile from the main construction. I walked there this morning despite being told to keep to my assigned area. What I found troubles me deeply. At least 20 men lie in that shed with almost no care. One woman, a young girl, really cannot be more than 16, tends to them as best she can with nothing but water and rags. The heat inside that shed is unbearable. Many of the men are clearly dying. I confronted the overseer about this barbaric treatment, and was told quite plainly that the commissioners cannot afford to halt construction for illness, that the sick will either recover or they won't, and that my job is stonework, not nursing. I feel ashamed to be part of this enterprise. The young girl Williamson mentioned appears nowhere in official records. Enslaved women worked on the project too, primarily as cooks and nurses, but their presence is barely documented. This particular girl may have been brought specifically to tend the sick. An enslaved person with nursing experience hired temporarily and then returned to her master when the crisis passed or didn't pass. Williamson's final entry on the subject, dated August 5th, 1797, is chilling in its brevity. The shed near the kiln is empty now, all of them. I asked what happened to the men who were there. I was told they'd recovered and been sent back to their plantations, but I saw no wagons arrive to transport them. I saw no men walking or being helped away. The shed is simply empty, and no one will speak of it. I suspect something terrible has occurred, but I have no proof and no one to tell who would care. What happened to those sick workers? If they'd truly recovered and been returned, there would be documentation, letters from plantation owners acknowledging the return, complaints about workers arriving in weakened condition, something. Instead, there's silence, a void in the records where answers should be. One of the few surviving plantation owners' letters from this period provides a troubling hint. Samuel Hanson, the man who'd hired out Isaac the carpenter, wrote to the commissioners in September 1797, inquiring about 3 of his enslaved workers who'd been sent to the project in June. I have received payment for their labor through July, Hanson wrote, but they have not been returned as I expected when I sent replacement workers in August. I would like to know their whereabouts and when they might return, as I have need of them for harvest work. The commissioner's reply, dated September 18th, 1797, is maddeningly vague. The workers to which you refer were afflicted with summer illness and could not continue. Arrangements were made for their care. We will inquire into their present situation and inform you accordingly. No follow-up letter exists to show whether the commissioners ever provided that information. Hanson's subsequent correspondence contains no further mention of those 3 workers, which suggests either he received a private verbal response or he gave up asking, but some plantation owners didn't give up. In November 1797, William Brent sent a pointed letter to the commissioners demanding the return of 5 enslaved workers, who hadn't come back to his plantation despite being replaced months earlier. I have lost use of 5 able workers for which I continue to receive payment, yet the workers themselves have not returned. This arrangement cannot continue. I demand either the return of these workers or an explanation of why they cannot return along with compensation for their loss if they have died in federal service. This letter hit a nerve. The commissioner's reply came within 3 days, unusually fast, and its tone was defensive. The workers to which you refer met with unfortunate circumstances during their service. Death occurred despite best efforts at treatment. We regret this outcome, but note that the work they were engaged in carried inherent risks which were known when they were contracted. Payment to you for their labor will cease as of November 1st, 1797. No additional compensation can be provided. so at least 5 of Brent's workers had died. The commissioners admitted as much when forced to, but no details were provided about how they died, where they were buried, or whether their families were notified. The letter treats their deaths as an unfortunate but unremarkable business matter. The workers died, the rental payment stopped, the matter was closed. How many others died? The commissioner's admission regarding Brent's 5 workers suggests deaths occurred but were being deliberately obscured in the records. If deaths were mentioned only when a plantation owner specifically demanded answers, how many deaths went entirely unreported because no one with standing bothered to ask? The architectural historian who would later analyze these documents, a man named Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, estimated in an 1882 private letter that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons likely perished during the president's house construction, though official records acknowledge no such thing. The Latrobe based this estimate on gaps in the payment ledgers, sudden name substitutions, and the unusually high number of replacement workers requested during certain periods, particularly summer 1797. But even Latrobe's estimate might be conservative. If 50 people died during 8 years of construction with hundreds of workers employed, that would actually be a remarkably low mortality rate given the conditions. Other large construction projects of the era, canals, fortifications, harbor works, regularly saw mortality rates of 10 to 15% among enslaved workers. If that rate applied to the president's house with an estimated 4 to 500 enslaved workers cycling through the project, the death toll could have been 40 to 75 people. Where were they buried? This question leads to the discovery that superintendent made in 1901, the one that caused immediate halt to excavation and sworn secrecy among the workers. The restoration project that year involved reinforcing the East Wing's foundation. Workers dug down to expose the original foundation stones laid in 1792, about 6 ft below the current ground level. They found bones, human bones, at least a dozen skulls, according to the superintendent's private notes, along with numerous other bones that appeared to have been buried hastily and without ceremony. No coffins, no markers, just bones in the dirt beneath the building's foundation. The superintendent, a man named Henry Reed, immediately recognized the implications. If news spread that human remains had been found buried in unmarked graves beneath the White House, it would trigger investigations, questions, and potentially massive public scandal. Reed made a decision that afternoon. Rebury the bones exactly where they'd been found, tell no one outside the work crew, and continue with the renovation in a different area of the foundation. Reed kept a personal diary, which his descendants donated to the National Archives in 1978. His entry from October 12, 1901, describes the discovery in detail. We found them approximately 6 ft down, just outside the original eastern foundation line. The bones were mixed together with no attempt at proper burial I could discern. Some skulls showed damage consistent with trauma, though I am no medical expert. We counted at least 12 skulls, possibly more, as some were fragmentary. The Negro workers on our crew became very quiet when we uncovered them. One old man, a fellow named Joseph, who's worked on the grounds for 40 years, said he'd heard stories from his grandfather about workers buried near the house during original construction. He said his grandfather called them the forgotten ones. We rearied everything before day's end. I instructed all workers that nothing was found and that anyone speaking of this discovery would be immediately dismissed. I then moved the foundation work to the western side. I could not risk this becoming public knowledge. I confess I felt quite ill all evening thinking of those poor souls buried like refuse beneath this great house. Reed never filed an official report about the discovery. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He simply ensured the bones remained hidden and took the secret to his grave in 1924. Only the discovery of his diary decades later revealed what had been found and buried again. The bones raised terrible questions. If enslaved workers had been buried right outside the foundation, had they died during construction and been disposed of as quickly and quietly as possible? Were these some of the workers who disappeared from the records in summer 1797? Were there more burial sites elsewhere on the grounds that had never been discovered? Reed's diary mentions that the bones showed damage consistent with trauma. This could mean many things: injuries from construction accidents, the physical toll of brutal labor, or even violence. The diary doesn't elaborate, and without proper forensic examination, which Reed refused to allow, the truth about how these people died would remain forever unknown. What is certain is that at least a dozen human beings were buried in unmarked graves on the White House grounds, and that this fact was deliberately concealed not just in 1797, but again in 1901, when the evidence was literally in hand. Someone decided both times that these deaths were better left unacknowledged. But the question of who made that decision in 1797, and whether the deaths were truly accidents or something worse, would haunt the project's later history. The president's house wasn't completed until November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to occupy it. By then, most of the enslaved workers who'd built it had been returned to their plantations, scattered across Maryland and Virginia, their role in creating the building already being written out of the official narrative. The commissioner's final report on the project, submitted in December 1800, is a masterpiece of omission. It details every architectural feature, every cost, every challenge overcome. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks the skilled craftsmen who brought the building to life. It never once mentions that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people who received no payment, no recognition, and in some cases no burial. Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801 after his inauguration. Jefferson brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, laborers, to maintain the grounds. For Jefferson, the presence of enslaved people in the building wasn't ironic or contradictory. It was simply the way things were. He wrote eloquently about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, and he never seemed to grasp the profound dissonance in this arrangement. The building became known as the White House decades later, though the origin of that name is disputed. Some say it came from the white paint used to cover the sandstone walls after British troops burned the building in 1814. Others claim it was always called that because of the aqua sandstone's natural color. Either way, the name took hold, and with it, a mythology about the building's construction that was almost entirely false. Official White House histories written throughout the 19th century barely mentioned the enslaved workforce. When they did acknowledge their existence, it was with euphemistic language like servants, workers from local plantations, or contracted labor. The implication was always that these were ordinary employees doing ordinary work for ordinary compensation. The fact that they were enslaved, that they had no choice, that they received nothing, all of this was smoothed over, sanitized, rendered invisible. Even histories that acknowledged slavery's role in construction minimized it. An 1831 guidebook to Washington described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers brought together through the federal commissioner's diligent efforts. Technically true, but brought together makes it sound like a voluntary collaboration rather than coerced labor. The guidebook's author, a man named Jonathan Elliott, certainly knew the truth. He'd researched the commissioner's papers, but he chose language that wouldn't disturb readers' patriotic pride in the building. This pattern of selective memory continued through the century when major renovations occurred in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1860s. Newspapers covered them extensively, but never thought to investigate who'd built the original structure or under what conditions. When presidents gave tours and speeches about the house's history, they spoke of architectural influences from Irish and Scottish traditions, but never mentioned the African hands that actually constructed the walls. Some people knew the truth, though. They just didn't have platforms to share it. Among the enslaved community in Washington and surrounding areas, The story of the building's construction was passed down through generations. Elderly people who'd worked on the project told their children and grandchildren what it had really been like. They described the heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared and never returned. They talked about the bones buried on the grounds, the marked stones hidden in the walls, the names that no one would remember. One of these stories was preserved in a remarkable document discovered in 1978. Among papers donated to Howard University was a handwritten narrative by a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819. Robertson's grandfather, Thomas, had worked on the president's house construction in the 1790s. She wrote down his stories as he told them to her in the 1840s, creating one of the only first-hand accounts of what the work was actually like. Thomas's stories filtered through his granddaughter's memory and writing paint a picture that's far darker than any official history. Grandfather Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs couldn't straighten. He said the white overseers didn't see them as men, but as tools like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends in the night when no one was watching, said prayers over them that nobody wrote down. He said his friend Peter carved his name in a stone and told Thomas, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember long after we're gone. Our names will be in those walls even if nobody can see them." Grandfather cried when he told me that. He said Peter never came home from the work, said he got sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Celia Robertson's account continues with stories of her grandfather's trauma from the experience. He had nightmares about the house for the rest of his life. She wrote he'd wake up shaking, saying he could still hear the sounds of men dying in that shed where they put the sick ones. He said he tried to help them, tried to bring them water, but the overseers wouldn't let him near. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, for their wives, for water, for mercy. He said the sound stopped after a few days and then the shed was empty and nobody would say what happened to those men. Thomas also described the incident that left several workers dead from a scaffolding collapse, confirming Colin Williamson's diary entry. Grandfather said he saw the scaffold break and 3 men fall, 1 white man and 2 colored. The white man was carried away and tended to immediately. The 2 colored men lay there broken on the ground for near an hour before anybody even looked at them. 1 man had his leg twisted wrong and kept screaming. The other wasn't moving at all. Finally, they carried them both to the shed. He never saw either of them again. Robertson's document wasn't publicly known until it was discovered among Howard University's archives and written about in an obscure academic journal in 1982. Even then, it received little attention. The mainstream historical community largely ignored it, perhaps because it contradicted the more comfortable narrative about the building's origins that had been established over nearly 2 centuries. But the document raised important questions. If Thomas's memories were accurate, and there's no reason to think his granddaughter fabricated them, then the official record had deliberately obscured numerous deaths and terrible working conditions. The shed where they put the sick ones matched the location Colin Williamson described in his diary. The scaffolding incident matched Williamson's account almost perfectly. Thomas's stories and Williamson's contemporary observations were corroborating each other across decades. This convergence of evidence suggested something historians had long suspected but could never quite prove. The president's house construction involved significant loss of enslaved lives, and those losses were systematically erased from the historical record. The physical evidence supported this conclusion, too. In 1978, the same year Robertson's account was discovered, a team of archaeologists conducted a survey of the White House grounds as part of a comprehensive historical documentation project. The survey included ground-penetrating radar analysis of areas that had never been developed or significantly disturbed since the 1790s. The radar revealed anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in at least 3 locations on the grounds. One site, was very close to where Henry Reed's crew had discovered bones in 1901. Another was near the old kiln site that Williamson had mentioned in his diary. The third was in an area that's now part of the Rose Garden. The archaeologists noted these findings in their technical report, but recommended against excavation. Given the political sensitivity of potentially discovering human remains on the White House grounds, the report stated, and the fact that any such remains would likely be enslaved individuals buried without ceremony or record, we recommend these sites be left undisturbed and marked as potentially sensitive areas for future reference. In other words, we know there are probably bodies buried here, but digging them up would be politically complicated, so let's just note it and move on. This decision, like Henry Reed's decision in 1901 and the Commissioner's decisions in the 1790s, prioritized institutional reputation over historical truth and human dignity. The people buried in those unmarked graves had been forgotten in death just as they'd been exploited in life. Even when evidence of their existence surfaced, the response was to rebury it, literally or figuratively. The architectural historian who'd estimated 30 to 50 deaths, Benjamin Latrobe Jr., became obsessed with uncovering the true toll. After reviewing the surviving commissioner's papers in the 1880s, Latrobe began corresponding with elderly African Americans in the Washington area, trying to collect oral histories before that generation passed away. He managed to record accounts from 17 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the president's house construction. Their stories were remarkably consistent. All mentioned brutal working conditions, insufficient food and water, endemic sickness, and people who vanished from the workforce and were never heard from again. Several specifically mentioned the summer of 1797 as particularly deadly. One man told Latrobe, "My grandmother said her uncle went to work on the president's building and caught the fever that summer when it was so hot. She said they took him to a place away from the others, and her mother went looking for him but couldn't find where they'd put him. Later they told her he'd died and been buried, but they wouldn't say where. She looked for his grave for years but never found it." Latrobe compiled these accounts into a manuscript he hoped to publish as a corrective to the sanitized histories. He titled it "The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings," but no publisher would touch it. Latrobe tried for 5 years to get the manuscript published, but the rejections were unanimous, too controversial, not appropriate for current readership, lacks sufficient documentation, and most tellingly would damage the reputation of venerable institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, bitter and frustrated. His manuscript remained unpublished until 1934, when a small academic press released it in an edition of just 500 copies. It sold poorly and quickly went out of print. The book is now extremely rare. Most copies were lost or destroyed over the years. Only about 24 copies are known to exist today, scattered among university libraries and private collections. Even when the truth was documented and available, it couldn't gain traction against the established narrative, the mythology of the White House as a symbol of democratic ideals and American values was too powerful, too important to national identity. Acknowledging that it had been built on the backs of enslaved people who died unmarked and forgotten. That acknowledgement would require confronting uncomfortable truths about the nation's founding that most Americans weren't ready to face. So the truth remained buried, quite literally in some cases, beneath decades and then centuries of silence. The president's house wasn't completed until November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to occupy it. By then, most of the enslaved workers who'd built it had been returned to their plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia, their role in creating the building already being written out of the official narrative. The commissioner's final report on the project, submitted in December 1800, is a masterpiece of omission. It details every architectural feature, every cost, every challenge overcome. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks the skilled craftsmen who brought the building to life. It never once mentions that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people who received no payment, no recognition, and in some cases no burial. Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801 after his inauguration. Jefferson brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, laborers to maintain the grounds. For Jefferson, the presence of enslaved people in the building was ironic or contradictory. It was simply the way things were. He wrote eloquently about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, and he never seemed to grasp the profound dissonance in this arrangement. Among the enslaved community in Washington and surrounding areas, the story of buildings' construction was passed down through whispered conversations and quiet warnings. Elderly people who'd worked on the project told their children what it had really been like. They described the heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared and never returned. They talked about the bones buried somewhere on the grounds, the marked stones hidden in the walls, the names that no one would remember. One such story survived in a remarkable way. In 1843, a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819, began writing down her grandfather Thomas' stories about working on the President's house in the 1790s. She kept these writings hidden, knowing that enslaved people caught with written materials could face severe punishment. Her account, preserved secretly and passed down through her family, would remain unknown to historians for generations. Thomas's stories, filtered through his granddaughter's careful memory and secret writing, painted a picture far darker than any official history. Grandfather Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs couldn't straighten. He said the white overseers didn't see them as men, but as tools, like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends in the night when no one was watching, said prayers over them that nobody wrote down. The account continued with stories that matched details from other sources. He said his friend Peter carved his name in a stone and told Thomas, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember. Long after we're gone, our names will be in those walls, even if nobody can see them." Grandfather cried when he told me that. He said Peter never came home from the work, said he got sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Thomas also described the shed near the kiln where sick workers were taken during that terrible summer of 1797. Grandfather said he tried to help them, tried to bring them water, but the overseers wouldn't let him near. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, for their wives, for water, for mercy. He said the sound stopped after a few days, and then the shed was empty, and nobody would say what happened to those men. He had nightmares about it until the day he died. If you're finding this story as disturbing as it truly is, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. What do you think happened to those men in that shed? The theories and discussions in the comments help us all understand these dark chapters of history together. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this need to be told and remembered. Celia Robertson's account remained hidden in her family for decades after her death in 1889. By then, official histories of the President's house had already solidified into comfortable mythology that barely acknowledged enslaved labor at all. An 1831 guidebook described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers brought together through the federal commissioner's diligent efforts. The phrase "brought together" made coerced labor sound like voluntary collaboration. Meanwhile, occasional evidence would surface that contradicted the sanitized narrative, only to be quickly buried again. In 1867, during Andrew Johnson's presidency, workers repairing foundation damage from decades of settling discovered several artifacts that had clearly been left by 18th-century laborers. Among them was a small wooden disc about 2 inches in diameter with careful carving on both sides. One side had the initials PL. The other side had what appeared to be a date, 1796. The maintenance supervisor recognized this might be significant and reported it to the White House steward. The steward examined the disc, noted it in his daily log, as curious article found during repair work appears old, and placed it in a storage cabinet. No further investigation was conducted. The disc sat forgotten in that cabinet, while the man whose initials were carved on it, likely Peter Lennox, remained as forgotten as he'd been for 70 years. That same year, something else was discovered that the White House steward did not record in his official log, though he mentioned it in a private letter to his brother, dated September 14th, 1867. During foundation repairs this month, the workers uncovered what appeared to be human remains in the soil near the eastern wall, old bones, several skulls. The workers became quite agitated, especially the colored men on the crew. I consulted with the president's secretary about what should be done. We agreed the matter was best handled quietly. The bones were reared in the same location, and the repair work continued in a different area. I suspect these were workers who died during original construction and were buried hastily on the grounds. But raising questions about this now would serve no good purpose and might cause unnecessary scandal. The steward's decision to rebury the bones and stay silent set a precedent that would be followed again decades later. The dead would stay buried, the questions would stay unasked. In 1891, the Interior Department commissioned a historian named Herbert Braftoft to write a comprehensive history of federal buildings. Bancroft was given access to archives that previous historians had never seen, including correspondence between the commissioners and plantation owners that had been stored in a War Department warehouse and largely forgotten. What Braftoft found in those yellowed letters disturbed him deeply. He found the exchange between William Brent and the commissioners in which they admitted 5 of Brent's workers had died. He found at least a dozen similar exchanges with other plantation owners. He found records of payment disputes where owners demanded compensation for workers who hadn't been returned. He found medical bills that suggested far more workers had required treatment than the commissioners had acknowledged publicly. Most disturbing was a letter he discovered from Samuel Davidson to his brother, dated December 1797, that had apparently never been sent. Davidson had written it in obvious anger. I have received notification from the federal commissioners that 3 of my workers have died while in their service this past summer. They died in July, supposedly of fever, though no physician examined them as far as I can determine. Brother, these were healthy, strong men I sent to Washington in June. 3 months later, all 3 are dead, and I am told this is simply unfortunate luck. I do not believe it was luck at all. I believe conditions at that construction site are barbaric. The overseers are cruel and negligent, and men are dying from abuse as much as from any fever. The letter continued with an accusation that made Bancroft stop and reread it twice. I have spoken with other owners who sent workers to that said project. William Brent lost 5 men, and was told nothing until he demanded answers. I spoke with Notley Young, who said at least a dozen of his workers came back sick and weakened, and 3 died within weeks of returning home. The true toll of this construction is far higher than anyone will admit. I will not send another living soul to work on federal projects. Braftoft sat in that archive room for a long time after reading Davidson's letter. If the plantation owner's information was accurate, and Braftoft had found documentation confirming Brent's 5 deaths, then at least 24 enslaved workers had died that Davidson knew about. And Davidson explicitly stated, the true toll is far higher than anyone will admit. Braftoft compiled his findings into a section of his manuscript titled The Human Cost of Construction. He wrote carefully but honestly about what the records revealed. The construction of the President's House, that great symbol of American democracy, was accomplished in significant part through the forced labor of enslaved persons. The conditions under which they worked were brutal. The compensation they received was nothing, and the deaths that occurred, deaths which available evidence suggests numbered at minimum 40 individuals and quite possibly more, were deliberately obscured in official records and have been omitted from all subsequent histories of the building. When Bancroft submitted his draft manuscript to the Interior Department in early 1892, the response came swiftly. A letter dated March 3, 1892 instructed him in unambiguous terms, while we appreciate your thorough research, We feel that the section regarding unfortunate incidents during construction does not serve the purpose of this commissioned history, which is to celebrate the architectural and engineering achievements of our federal buildings. Please remove this section entirely and focus on the positive aspects of these great American landmarks. Bancroft protested. He wrote back, arguing that a complete history must include uncomfortable truths, that omitting the deaths and suffering of enslaved workers was a disservice to historical accuracy and to the memory of those who died. The Interior Department's reply was even more direct. Remove the section or the book would not be published and he would not be paid. Bancroft had spent 2 years on the project. He had a family to support. He removed the section, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He kept the deleted pages among his personal papers along with copies of the most damning letters he'd found. He wrote a note on the folder containing them. The truth about how the president's house was built, removed from my history at government insistence. May someone braver than I eventually tell this story. H.B., April 1892. The published version of Bancroft's history appeared in 1893. It contained exactly 1 paragraph about enslaved labor. The project employed workers from area plantations under contract with their masters, a common practice of the era. These workers contributed their skills to the construction of this magnificent building. Bancroft's deleted section with its careful documentation of deaths, its quotes from Davidson's damning letter, its estimate of 40 or more casualties, remained in his personal files. When Bancroft died in 1918, his papers were stored in boxes by his family, who didn't know what historical significance they contained. The architectural historian Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, had spent years in the 1880 trying to piece together the truth about the president's house construction. He'd reviewed what records he could access. He'd interviewed elderly African Americans whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the project. He'd collected 17 oral histories, all consistent in describing brutal conditions, endemic sickness, and people who vanished and never returned. Latrobe compiled everything into a manuscript he titled The Hidden Cost Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings. He estimated, based on gaps in payment records and the oral histories he'd collected, that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons had likely perished during the president's house construction. For 5 years, Latrobe tried to find a publisher. Every response was the same: too controversial, not appropriate for current readership, lacks sufficient documentation, and most tellingly would damage the reputation of venerable institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, his manuscript unpublished. His papers were donated to a university library where they sat uncatalogued and unread in boxes marked simply Latrobe Architectural Notes. The truth was available. It was documented. It was in archives and family papers and university collections, but it couldn't gain traction against the established narrative. The mythology of the White House as a pure symbol of American ideals was too important, too central to national identity. Acknowledging it had been built on the backs of enslaved people who died and were forgotten. That acknowledgement would require confronting truths that most Americans in the late 19th century weren't willing to face. In October 1901, the discovery that Henry Reed's crew made beneath the East Wing Foundation brought all of these buried truths rushing back to the surface, at least for the few people who knew about it. The restoration project that fall involved reinforcing foundations that had settled over a century. Workers dug down to expose the original stones laid in 1792. At approximately 6 ft below the current ground level, a worker's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or soil. He called his foreman over. They dug more carefully: bones, human bones, a skull, then another, then more. The foreman immediately stopped the crew and sent for Superintendent Henry Reed. Reed arrived within the hour and examined what they'd uncovered. At least a dozen skulls were visible, along with numerous other bones that appeared to have been buried hastily without ceremony. No coffins, no markers, no artifacts. just human remains discarded in the dirt beneath the building's foundation. Reed was 53 years old and had worked on prominent buildings throughout Washington for 30 years. He understood immediately what he was looking at and what it meant. He also understood that if this discovery became public knowledge, it would trigger questions that would lead to investigations that would uncover the history that had been so carefully buried for a century. He made his decision within an hour. The crew would rebury everything exactly where it had been found. They would tell no one. They would move the foundation work to the western side of the building, and every worker on the crew would be told that discussing this discovery with anyone would result in immediate dismissal. The Negro workers on the crew had become very quiet when the bones were uncovered. One older man, a laborer named Joseph, who'd worked on the White House grounds for 40 years, approached Reed as the reburial was taking place. "Sir," Joseph said quietly, "my father worked on building this house back in the old days. He told stories before he died. He said there were men buried near the house, workers who died, and nobody wanted to make a fuss about it. He called them the forgotten ones." Reed looked at the old man. "Did your grandfather say how many?" "He didn't know for certain, sir, but he said it was more than a few. He said there was a bad summer, terrible hot, and a lot of men got sick. He said they took the sick ones away to a shed somewhere, and after a while you didn't hear them anymore. He said folks knew they'd died, but nobody would say it plain. Just buried them quiet and kept working." Reed nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me that, Joseph. But this discovery, what we found today, it doesn't leave this work site. You understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand." Joseph paused. "But those men deserve better than being buried twice with no one knowing." "I know they do," Reed said, "but that's not a decision I can make." That evening, Reed sat in his room at a boarding house near the White House and wrote in his personal diary, "We found them today. At least 12 skulls, possibly more, buried roughly outside the original eastern foundation. No coffins, no markers, no dignity. Some skulls showed damage that might be from trauma, though I'm no expert. Joseph, one of our Negro workers, said his grandfather told stories about workers buried near the house during construction. He called them the Forgotten Ones, an apt name. We reread everything this afternoon. I've told the crew that anyone who speaks of this will be dismissed immediately. I've moved the foundation work to the west side. This discovery cannot become public knowledge, but I confess I felt ill all evening thinking of those souls buried like Rifu beneath this great symbol of our republic." Reed never filed an official report. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He kept the secret until his death 23 years later, and only his private diary, which his family kept but never read carefully, preserved any record of what had been found. The bones that Reed and his crew reared that October afternoon in 1901 remained in the ground, as forgotten in the 20th century as they had been in the 18th. The men they belonged to, some of whom were probably listed on the paper hidden in the foundation, some of whom had carved their names in stones now hidden behind plaster, stayed nameless and unmourned. But the discovery raised questions that Reed couldn't help but think about, even though he'd never asked them aloud. If at least 12 people were buried right outside the eastern foundation, how many more were buried elsewhere on the grounds? Property covered 18 acres. Were there other burial sites that had never been disturbed? How many people had really died building this house? Reed thought about Joseph's grandfather's story of the shed where sick workers were taken that terrible summer. He thought about the skulls with trauma damage. He thought about the fact that no official records acknowledged any of this. Someone in 1797 had decided these deaths weren't worth documenting. Someone in 1867 had decided bones found during repairs should be quietly reared. And now Reed himself had made the same decision in 1901. The pattern was clear. The dead would stay buried, the truth would stay hidden, and the comfortable mythology about the building would remain undisturbed. Following spring in March 1902, workmen were removing old plaster from interior walls during renovation work when they discovered something that James Hoban had documented back in 1796. Behind the plaster, on stones that had been turned inward so their carved faces wouldn't be visible, were shallow scratches that weren't random at all. They were names, initials, small deliberate marks carved by the people who'd shaped the stones. One worker noticed a stone with clear letters, th, another had PL. A third showed what looked like Isaac carved carefully into the cream-colored sandstone. The workmen called over their supervisor, who examined the markings and then ordered the workers to replace the plaster immediately and not discuss what they'd found. But one worker, a young man named Timothy O'Brien, made a sketch of 3 of the carved stones before the plaster was replaced. He wrote in his own diary that evening, "Found names carved in the stones today. Old James, the colored man who works in the basement, says those were likely enslaved men who built this place. He says they carved their names so they wouldn't be forgotten. Supervisor told us to cover them back up and not talk about it. Seems wrong leaving those names hidden, but I suppose that's how it's always been." O'Brien's sketch showed 3 sets of markings, T on one stone, PL on another, Isaac on a third, Peter Lennox, Thomas Isaac. Names that appeared in the commissioner's payment ledgers a century earlier, now rediscovered, carved in stone, and immediately hidden again. The plaster was replaced that afternoon. The names were covered once more. The workers moved on to other walls, other renovations. Within a week, everyone had stopped thinking about the carved stones. If they'd thought about them at all, Theodore Roosevelt, who occupied the White House during these renovations, was never told about the bones found the previous year or the carved names discovered that spring. The information was deemed irrelevant to the president's concerns. Superintendent Reed had kept his silence, and the renovation supervisors saw no reason to break it. By the summer of 1902, all the renovation work was complete. The White House looked magnificent. Its structure reinforced, its interiors refreshed. Visitors admired the building's beauty and historical significance. Tour guides told stories about the architecture, the presidents who'd lived there, the important decisions made within its walls. No one mentioned the bones buried on the grounds. No one spoke of the names hidden in the walls. No one acknowledged the price that had been paid to build this symbol of American democracy. In plantation communities throughout Maryland and Virginia, elderly people still told stories about grandparents or great-grandparents who'd worked on the president's house construction and never came home. These stories were passed down through generations, preserved in African American families even as they disappeared from official history, but by 1902 most of those elderly storytellers had died. Their children remembered some of the stories, but the details grew vaguer with each generation. Names were forgotten, specific incidents blurred together. The truth became harder to distinguish from embellishment or confusion. Celia Robertson had died in 1889, and her carefully hidden writings about her grandfather Thomas's experiences remained secreted away, unknown to anyone outside her immediate family. Herbert Bankford's deleted manuscript section sat in a box in his study. Benjamin Latrobe Jr.'s unpublished book gathered dust in a university storage room. The White House steward's 1867 letter to his brother about finding bones had been discarded after his brother's death. Henry Reed's diary sat on a shelf in his bedroom, unread by anyone. The truth existed, scattered across dozens of documents and memories and hidden artifacts, but scattered truth is invisible truth. Without someone to gather the pieces, to insist they mattered, to force the uncomfortable questions, the truth might as well not exist at all. The president's house stood gleaming in the Washington sun, arguably the most recognizable building in America. Visitors from across the country came to admire it. School children learned about its history. Artists painted it. Photographers captured it. Politicians worked within it. And beneath their feet, in unmarked graves scattered across the grounds, lay at least a dozen people who'd built the foundation those visitors walked upon. No one knew their names. No one knew exactly where they were buried. No one knew precisely how they died or how many others had died with them. The questions that should have been asked in 1797 were never asked. Investigations that should have happened in 1008, 167 or 1008, 191 or 19, 101 never occurred. The recognition that should have been given was never offered. The carved names stayed hidden behind plaster. The bones stayed buried in the earth. The documents stayed scattered and unread in various archives and private collections, and the comfortable myth that the president's house had been built by skilled craftsmen working under normal circumstances remained undisturbed. In the Negro neighborhoods of Washington, some people still knew different. Old folks would point toward the White House and say, "My people built it with their own hands and got nothing for it. Some of them died building it and got buried right there on the grounds, but you won't read about that in any book." Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren heard these claims but didn't always believe them. The story seemed too painful, too accusatory against the nation's greatest symbol. Surely, if enslaved people had built the White House and died in the process, that would be in the history books. Surely, the government would acknowledge something that important, but it wasn't in the history books. Government didn't acknowledge it. The stories were true, but they existed only in oral tradition among the descendants of the enslaved, while the written history told a different, cleaner tale. This is how truth dies, not in one dramatic suppression, but in 1,000 small decisions to look away, to stay silent, to prioritize comfort over honesty. Herbert Bancroft removing his section rather than losing his payment. Henry Reed ying the bones rather than creating scandal. Renovation supervisors ordering plaster replaced overcarved names rather than acknowledging their significance. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Each person who chose silence had understandable reasons, but the accumulation of all those reasonable decisions meant that people who'd built the White House with their own hands, who'd died in the process, who'd carved their names in stone, hoping to be remembered, those people were forgotten anyway. The White House still stands more than a century after those bones were found and reared. It stands on foundations laid by people whose names were erased from history. It was built with labor that was never compensated, never acknowledged, never honored, and for generations after 1902, the comfortable mythology persisted because the truth had been buried too many times, too deeply by too many people who chose not to see it. This mystery shows us how historical truth can be methodically erased through seemingly reasonable decisions. How institutional silence can be more powerful than active censorship.